Okay, welcome everybody, both here in the room and online. My name is Chris Perrine. I'm the Chief of Party for the USAID Atlas program. Atlas is a climate change adaptation and resilience program. We do analysis of climate risk in various economic development sectors and provide recommendations for programming both for USAID and for host country governments, et cetera. And we host these monthly events, these Adaptation Community Meetings here at the Chemonics office. They're generally the third Thursday of each month, as this one is today. So I encourage you to sign up on climatelinks.org if you'd like to get notification of these meetings and you're not already signed up. You also get all kinds of other interesting notifications about all kinds of events and release of all kinds of interesting reports and things that relate to resilience and climate adaptation, et cetera. Let's see. So I'm going to pass things over to Eric Hyman in a moment to introduce our panel today on this interesting topic from the folks at CEDAR. But before I do that, one other thing. So the meeting next month, which will be on March 21st, will be on the subject of heat and how heat affects human health. We're obviously seeing increasing heat, year-on-year averages increasing, particularly in urban areas. And so that's the focus of some work that Chemonics under Atlas has done recently. So we'll focus on that, and it'll be another panel discussion like this one. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass the microphone, so to speak, to Eric Hyman to introduce today's topic and our panel.
Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
The topic today is on supporting planning and financing for climate adaptation. We're going to be reporting on, the topic today is on planning and financing for climate adaptation. We're going to be talking about some examples of the work that the CEDAR activity has done over the past 5 years. It's been a task order under the Public Financial Management IDIQ. It has core funding from the USAID Washington Economic Growth, Education and Environment Bureau's Global Climate Change Office, and co-managed with the E3 Economic Policy Office. So this is the list of topics for today, a little bit about CEDAR, then a tiny bit about some of CEDAR's work on clean energy and sustainable landscapes, which we also have been doing a lot of work on, and then focusing on the adaptation work and specifically on 3 examples therein. Four examples: climate finance assessment, adaptation planning and financing in Madagascar, public-private partnerships for disaster risk reduction in India, and some adaptation financing and training work in fisheries and agriculture in Senegal. So CEDAR has a ceiling of approximately $20 million. It's implemented by Crown Agents USA and Apt Associates. And the main focus is helping governments, the private sector, and civil society make the business and economic case for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation includes clean energy and sustainable landscapes. And there's also been a lot of work in financing or to support financing in each of these 3 areas. So I'd like to introduce now the panelists, Dr. Marcy Gallen-Trump, who's the Chief of Party from Apt Associates, and 2 other members of the adaptation team. And actually the entire panel consists of doctors today, so you have a lot of expertise here. We have Dr. Glenn Anderson and Dr. Laureen Jongola. So Marcy will continue now on CEDAR's adaptation work.
just quickly, I'm going to go over a bit more detail. As Eric mentioned, thank you for the introductions, Eric, and also just wanted to give out the fact that CEDAR, as you said, was interested in, had funding in 3 major areas for clean energy, sustainable landscapes, and adaptation. And we're going to be going over the adaptation in depth today. But I do want to just say that there's 2 next on CEDAR support for clean energy and CEDAR support for sustainable landscapes. Goes through a lot of bullets where we, in fact, go in more detail about the results. Now, this first one is on the clean energy, and we had what we sort of distilled down to 3 building blocks for a lot of what we were doing in CEDAR throughout. One, the first one was enabling environment. We were working in technical assistance for that, building those up. Those are also policy, regulatory, et cetera, and legal frameworks. Then we were doing capacity development as well as doing information dissemination, knowledge sharing. And the third area, which people have really begun to stress a lot more, in the realization that they need to really go into the financing and to really allow for people to understand how to create the financing tools or instruments and mechanisms so that these ideas, these project ideas, can really make it into a sustainable development path. And the second slide here is on sustainable landscapes. That intersects, as Eric was saying, with adaptation quite clearly. And that is a separate area that we also did about 5 or 6 activities on under CEDAR. Now, I just want to say that we will be having some events happening. And if you went to the slide, should be going backwards for the clean energy. Go back. Yeah, no, it didn't. No. There are some upcoming events. There was what we had in December for the forums. We've got a March 7th and then a March 12th other supplier forums. So we're going to be having more events on clean energy. Matt Ogonowski is in the audience now. He's also one of our managers, and Jonathan Cook helped to lead the efforts on a lot of adaptation work that we did. And these events are going to be rolling out. You'll be able to see them. They'll be online through the CEDAR network. But if you have any questions about these 2 areas, clean energy, sustainable landscape, come up to me, come up to the USAID folks, and we can talk to them. But at this point, I want to turn our attention to the focus for today, which is on adaptation. And Glenn Anderson, we're very happy to have. He's been our manager, technical manager for the area, and then followed by Lorraine.
Green light means I can talk. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us, and those of you who are listening in on the webinar, including, I hope, one of my former staff who's out in Nebraska. This is a shout out to Jamie Carson. We're going to present an overview of the CEDAR adaptation highlights, and as Eric mentioned, we'll talk about three activities in particular. I'll present Madagascar, and Lorraine will present India and Senegal. And then at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about what have we learned, what are some of the lessons we've learned from this work. In terms of, I'm not going to go through and hit all of these bullets, but I want to just give you a basic perspective on how we've approached adaptation. We know that financing is really critical, that when you look at, if you go back and look at environmental planning, the problem was always getting the financing. You could come up with lots of ideas and that. And getting to finance, getting to implementation from adaptation planning has been a real challenge. And quite a bit of our work was focused on helping with the adaptation planning process, and we did this in Peru and Senegal and also in Madagascar, but also trying to get people to think about financing earlier in the process and to begin to think about the problems, the challenges you faced in terms of finding finance for your priority adaptation options. So we've approached adaptation planning from a very much a development perspective, integrated perspective, and also one of the things that USAID has championed is focusing on mainstreaming, trying to mainstream thinking about climate stressors and climate adaptation into your development planning. And so looking at how do you build up local planning into national strategies, how do you bring the private sector in to adaptation because they're a major source of financing and they'll be doing a lot of the implementation. So we've done quite a bit of climate finance training and adaptation planning training, and I'm going to just talk about a few of the other activities that you won't hear much about later. This slide just gives you a preview of the 3 activities. In case you didn't know where Madagascar, India, and Senegal are, you can see them on these 3 maps. Some of the other activities that we're not going to talk about in detail, a couple years ago we did a climate finance situation analysis in Bangladesh. And this was a case where there was quite a bit of donor money that was being provided for adaptation projects, and it wasn't being managed very effectively. And we went in and did an analysis of the institutional structure, the policies, and looked at opportunities to improve the way climate finance resources were being managed and used to support adaptation. The USAID Mozambique, I'll talk, was a training course that Eric was involved in, and I actually taught remotely a session or 2 on economics and planning for climate adaptation. Joel Smith supported the international chapter on national climate assessment that was completed in November. And several of us supported NAP Global Network, which is jointly funded by the State Department and GIZ, the German development agency. And they're supporting the development of national adaptation plans, and they're looking at financing issues as well in a number of countries throughout the developing country world. Finally, we prepared a report, which is still not quite final, called the Climate Finance Assessment. And in that, we focused on what are the opportunities to support climate finance, how to catalyze climate finance in clean energy, sustainable landscapes, and adaptation. And we organized that document according to what we call the 3 financing building blocks: enabling environment, information and capacity development, and financial instruments and markets. And the bulleted items here are some of the opportunities that are presented in the current draft of that report. It's not finalized. We may add some additional opportunities in that. But enabling environment is basically what does it take to incentivize the private sector to make investments in adaptation? Do we have the right set of policies? Can we accommodate public-private partnerships? Do we have the contractual, the procurement requirements to be able to do that? One of the things we've learned is that there's a huge gap in terms of the information that's available, particularly to the private sector, on adaptation financing. And there's a significant problem in terms of capacity to develop projects. And so this particular document is to help USAID or other donors understand the ways that the things that they need to do to be able to increase the financing for adaptation, clean energy, and sustainable landscapes.
We will be having an event on March 26th to discuss the climate finance report and some other related outputs. Stay tuned.
Okay, so I'm going to present Madagascar, and I'm going to apologize in advance. This activity is led by Charlotte Mack, who couldn't be here today because she lives in Indonesia. But Eric Hyman participated in the workshops that were held in November
And so if I miss anything, he can help fill in the gaps. In Madagascar, I mean, the problems that they're facing, there's quite a few climate issues: cyclones, sea level rise, drought, and flood. Sort of the full Monty of the kinds of problems we see in most countries that are dealing with climate change and climate variation. And one of the major problems in Madagascar is that they depend very much on their natural resource base for the livelihoods, particularly farmers and small entrepreneurs. And USAID Madagascar has developed a project which they refer to as the Conservation and Communities Project, and they have two activities that are underway under that. One is called Haitao, which focuses on decentralized, community-driven conservation. It's more of a biodiversity project. And Makaji, which is recently started last year, which supports local communities to manage their natural resources and benefit from those natural resources. Some of the challenges that face in Madagascar, and these are problems everybody faces: coordination between the different actors concerned with the design and implementation, climate policies, a problem where policy is almost inevitably top-down, but a lot of the activities are going to have to occur, and the pilots all occur at the local level. And so there's a real challenge to build those up from the bottom-up approach, and trying to find a way to combine sort of a top-down policy design with a bottom-up adaptation, implementation, and demonstration. There's a need to improve institutional legal frameworks, both for planning and implementation, particularly at the local level. And there's a problem of understanding roles and responsibilities for coordination and implementation. And these two projects will be trying to help, develop better sense of the roles and responsibilities so that local and national planners can work together effectively. The other major issue is climate sector engagement and finance. These are two issues. There is a basic awareness of climate impacts within the private sector, but not really their magnitude and how it affects their businesses and what they need to do to be able to understand that there are things they can do that will be beneficial to them in terms of becoming more climate resilient. They're dealing with some serious non-climate stressors, and such as corruption and theft. A lot of the adaptation is self-financed. If the private sector is doing any adaptation, it's not well coordinated with government, and it's not consistent with the priorities that are being set by the government in the country. On the finance side, a limited understanding of international funds and public funding sources that can be used to support adaptation. And there's quite a bit of need to understand better the access to finance in terms of understanding, I'm sorry, I'm looking at this slide and I'm going, what does this mean? Since I wrote it. There's, in terms of access to finance, some uncertainty about the climate impacts, the knowledge of costs and benefits of if they implement adaptation, and not having business models for adaptation investment are some of the problems. CEDIR conducted three workshops, actually. The first was a training of trainers of the staff from the two USAID projects in a number of climate planning and topics, and looking at how to integrate climate into biodiversity and livelihood activities, plans, and strategies. Then the trainees, turned around and led a climate adaptation and value chains workshop with CEDIR and USAID participation.
And in that workshop, they engaged the local private sector in using a value chain approach for certain commodities. And the plan is that the trainees will continue to replicate that training in other locations in Madagascar. CEDAR and Eric also conducted a climate finance workshop for participants in the two projects, USAID mission, local NGOs, and some government officials. Covered a range of topics, financial terms, types of instruments that are available, an overview of the types of public sector climate funds, different options for mobilizing public and private finance, and shared a number of examples from all over the world that are featured in the CFA, the Climate Finance Assessment that I mentioned earlier, and looking at those and helping people understand how those might be appropriate in Madagascar and how they could be used. And then I believe Eric gave an overview of the RED Plus activities for them. So the other thing that the CEDAR project has done has been to do some analysis, some of its desktop analysis, and helping them to look at potential financing sources for the two activities, looking at what we call conservation impact investors, local private sector representatives, and looking at different sources of finance, types of criteria that you have to meet to access that, and looking at how can we engage the private investors and funders in supporting adaptation and biodiversity investments in Madagascar. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Lorraine.
Okay, thanks Gwen. Thanks everyone for joining us here in the room and online. We'd like to tell you some more about the process and the outcomes of the Cedar India activity, where we are working to develop public-private partnerships for disaster risk reduction in 4 Indian cities. This initiative has built on an existing partnership between USAID India and the UN Development Program, where UNDP is already working on a project funded by USAID India to develop resilient cities through risk reduction to disaster and climate change. And under that initiative, grants are helping municipalities cover the costs of risk reduction investments in their communities. The Cedar India activity is working in 4 of the 6 cities that are involved in the UNDP initiative. So we've been working in Vijayawada, Visakhapatnam, Cuttack, and Navi Mumbai. And to build on this initiative, CEDAR is partnering with UNDP to develop public-private partnerships for disaster risk reduction projects. And we're working in a very interesting context because India has a favorable enabling environment for PPPs. The 2013 India Companies Act mandated corporate social responsibility, or CSR, contributions of 2% of average net profits to initiatives with social benefits. So there's a lot of financing already available for these investments. Of course, on the other hand, that means that if you're working in a context that doesn't have this kind of favorable enabling environment, this initiative would probably be a lot more difficult. Our team addressed a few challenges in developing the PPPs. We found that municipalities often have a limited understanding of disaster risk reduction options and benefits. Some of the municipal leaders that we were working with had a hard time identifying exactly which actions they believed would be effective in reducing the disaster risk of their communities. So CEDAR has been working with them through that process to think about the technical solutions and the activities to carry out to reduce disaster risk. Local governments also have limited resources or expertise to design DRR investments and need to rely on external partners. And it's also important that the public sector provide incentives for the private sector to commit their time and resources to these activities. Private partners have a lot of options for how to invest their CSR funds. And of course, they want to invest money in actions that that bring them public publicity and cast a good light on their CSR contributions. Another key lesson that we learned in this PPP development activity is that it's very important to understand private partners' CSR planning cycles. As we were working on the ground with private partners, in some cases we found that they were interested in the activities that were proposed, but they had already committed their CSR funds for this budget cycle and even sometimes the next budget cycle. So it's important to be aware of those planning cycles and to take advantage of the window of opportunity when private partners are actually making decisions about how to commit their funds. So to design the public-private partnership, CEADIR partnered with the Energy and Resources Institute, or CARI, which is a Delhi-based organization. And our local CEDAR team and our CARI colleagues on the ground in Delhi have been coordinating with UNDP in the 4 cities to engage municipal leaders and to identify the specific DRR needs and potential private sector investments, where they think the private sector could most make a difference in their activities. We developed and presented potential PPPs and investment options to private companies, and then we helped secure commitments for private company contributions toward the DRR activities. We were very happy that we were able to secure diverse types of contributions from the private partners. Not only did we get direct funds and procurement of goods and services, but we also got private partners to commit their technical expertise and their staff time to conducting GIS mapping and analysis activities. A railroad company donated land to be able to plant trees on its own private land, and other companies also are providing logistics support for project management, organization of stakeholder engagement activities, and outreach to the community. Overall, we have developed 10 public-private partnerships in the cities, and I'll just give you a brief one-sentence summary of each of those, just so you have an idea of what kind of activities we've been working on. In Visakhapatnam, we've developed 5 PPPs. One is a health information system to develop a database of critical assets and health infrastructure in the city, and to develop standard operating procedures to improve response times and coordination during emergency response. Another was an activity to integrate emergency health services into the city operations center, and this involved installing GPS technology in ambulances to help them coordinate and communicate during disasters and to find appropriate routes to respond during an emergency. Another private partner is helping to support mapping critical community facilities and developing some baseline maps that the municipality can use to identify critical sites, potentially hazardous sites, evacuation routes, and to improve disaster response and coordination in an emergency. Another partner is helping to enhance the resilience of critical community facilities. This PPP involves retrofitting critical facilities. Some of that includes the hard measures, such as actual infrastructure improvements and retrofitting buildings. It also includes soft measures, things like upgrading amenities, communication systems, technologies within those critical facilities. And then the last PPP in Visakhapatnam is an information, education, and communication activity that involves extensive community outreach to provide training to the public about how to respond to disasters and to behave appropriately during an emergency. In Cuttack, we've developed one PPP, although it's really quite an extensive one. In Cuttack, they have a major problem of solid waste management, and solid waste is clogging storm drains, and it's therefore contributing to flooding in the city. So by improving the solid waste management, they can reduce that flood risk. So this activity involves solid waste segregation and household level collection, transport of waste, storage of waste, and also a composting facility to help improve the waste management in the city. In Vijayawada, we have developed 4 PPPs, and you can see that the first 2 are similar to the PPPs in Visakhapatnam. There were a couple of private partners who have offered their services to conduct the same activity in multiple cities. So they'll also be mapping critical community facilities. They'll be doing the IEC and outreach campaigns. And then in Vijayawada, which I hear the British have called Blaze Wada, it's because it's an incredibly hot place, they have two initiatives to help build resilience to heat stress in the city. One at the city level, and this is the one I mentioned where the railroad company is donating land along the railroad to plant trees and to provide some cooling around the perimeter of the city. And then the second heat stress activity is at the individual level, where a private partner has developed and is contributing cooling jackets for outdoor workers, which are supposed to cool the skin surface by 5 to 6 degrees centigrade. So it could make a big difference for people who have to work outside in the heat for long periods of time. We've also been working in Navi Mumbai, and this PPP is still under development. So our colleagues at Perry and UNDP are currently working with the municipality. So by the time we wrap up the Cedar India activity, we can provide some more information about the outcomes of the Navi Mumbai PPP. The next case we'd like to talk about is CEDAR's work in Senegal, where we have been providing technical support for national adaptation financing. The government of Senegal has adopted a sectoral approach to NAP development. And in 2016, Senegal completed its first sectoral NAP for the fisheries sector. The fisheries sector is an important contributor to the economy of the country and also, of course, to the culture of the country. And Senegal, like many other coastal ecosystems and fisheries economies, has been experiencing major climate impacts and has major vulnerabilities to climate change and to the fisheries economies that depend on those natural resources. So recognizing that there would be some significant challenges in financing the adaptation actions that they've developed in their NAP, the USAID Senegal has requested CEDAR support for adaptation financing planning. Now, our team has encountered a few challenges in adaptation financing, not just in Senegal, but in all of the countries we worked with, really. Many countries' national adaptation planning processes have not integrated financing planning early in the process. Glenn spoke about this a little bit, and CEDAR really emphasizes the importance of thinking about financing from step zero in the adaptation planning process. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult to set priorities for adaptation actions. Even if you have very effective technical solutions, if you can't finance them, then they certainly face some problems by getting those actions on the ground. It also limits the ability to diversify financing for adaptation. One thing that we have seen a lot in the countries that we've worked in is that countries are planning to submit a $70 million proposal to the Green Climate Fund and expect all of that money to come through one single multilateral or bilateral funder. But of course, those funds are limited, and it's important for countries to think more strategically about how to secure funding for individual adaptation actions. Another challenge that we found is that many adaptation staff do not have training or experience in adaptation financing. Naturally, they're technical experts, they work on the ground in their own sectors, and they haven't necessarily had extensive financing training and haven't had experience in trying to finance their specific adaptation actions. One approach that CEDAR has used, and both Marcy and Glenn talked about our building blocks framework, provides a very tractable way for people who are not financing experts to think about very systematically how to finance adaptation actions, not only in broad packages, but also more strategically by task or phase of their projects. Those three building blocks are the enabling environment, capacity and information, and financing mechanisms and instruments. And we work closely with stakeholders in Senegal to think about each of these building blocks and to have them assess the institutional readiness to access the financing sources that they want to pursue. So in Senegal, CEDAR delivered a 3-day training on climate adaptation financing for the fisheries and agriculture sectors. And we collaborated with the USAID-funded Collaborative Management for a Sustainable Fisheries Future, or the ComFish Plus activity. In the workshop, we covered multiple topics and also had some very, I think, productive working group sessions at the sector level. We talked about adaptation financing principles and specifically how to link their adaptation financing strategies to a climate resilient development approach to national adaptation planning. We talked about international models of adaptation financing strategies. For example, we talked about Rwanda, where adaptation managers have integrated a basic financing strategy into the implementation plan. We also talked about Albania, which provides a different model and has a financing strategy document that is separate from the adaptation plan. And we also talked about CEADIR's approach to financing strategies in Peru, where we're using the building blocks model again to help adaptation managers think about not just which financing sources they want to pursue, but also about the readiness and their ability to access those financing sources. So we want to present in these cases a variety of examples and models for how countries can go about developing their financing strategies. We also work to identify sector adaptation goals and objectives and to make sure that those goals and objectives are linked directly to their existing sector development plans. We worked on developing priority adaptation actions that are appropriate for the development context. We, of course, emphasized the importance of identifying potential financing sources early on in the project development process. And through the building blocks approach, we assessed the strengths and limitations to accessing adaptation financing for the NAP. We had participants from the fisheries sector, agriculture sector, other natural resources sectors, financing and economic development ministries, and other external research institutions. And we were very pleased with the diversity of perspectives that we had in the room and the engagement that we got across multiple ministries in the government and also from other NGOs and academic institutions in Dakar and more broadly. We had 3 fisheries working groups, and they identified and described priority adaptation actions, and we asked them to use a simple project profile template that we've developed to think about which objectives they're trying to meet with each action they develop, the executing entity who would be responsible for carrying out that action, the timelines from implementation, the benefits of the proposed action, preliminary budgets and costs, and also the potential financing sources, not just to finance the project as a whole, but to think about potential financing sources for individual phases like design or planning or implementation or operations and maintenance or individual tasks within each action that they identify. The agriculture group in Senegal they have not yet developed a national adaptation plan for the agriculture sector. So they had not yet been through the full process of thinking through their adaptation goals and their priority actions that they'd like to implement. So I was facilitating the agriculture working group with another of our colleagues, and we decided we need to take a couple steps back to go back to step 0 with the agriculture group and to really start thinking about the climate impact on the sector, the primary vulnerabilities that they're concerned about, and specifically what are their adaptation goals and objectives for the sector. So we had a very productive conversation about what the agriculture sector needs to address and what they hope to accomplish through their national adaptation planning process. Now this is, we have a lot of words on this slide, but I mostly want to show you this slide to demonstrate the process, to tell you about what exactly we were doing in our working groups when we were applying the financing building blocks framework. So with each working group, we asked them to think about each building block, the enabling environment, capacity information, and financing mechanisms and instruments down the left side of the chart, and to think about the strengths, limitations, and potential actions that they could take to strengthen each building block. And we were so pleased with the outcomes of this activity. What we're showing you here are just a couple of the examples that we came up with in each block, and the full list was much more extensive. The groups are very engaged, and they have a really good idea of what the strengths are in their building blocks, how easy it will be to access certain types of financing, and they also have a good idea of the challenges that they'll face in trying to access other types of financing. And they did start to brainstorm some potential actions about how to improve their ability to access financing and to apply each of those building blocks. So for example, in the enabling environment, some of the strengths that the groups identified is that Senegal has a lot of political stability, and that's an asset for the enabling environment. There's already an existing framework for adaptation at the national level, so there's a lot of coordination at the national level among different line ministries and among different stakeholders. There are also favorable tax incentives. So that's just a couple examples of we were asking some guiding questions about, what are the strengths here? How easy is it to partner with the private sector? What are some of the information needs that you still have? How could you improve some of those institutional capacity areas? So we had a very productive conversation, and we can certainly provide some of the broader results from the Senegal working groups here. But we do want to show you the process that we worked through to help these groups think through and apply these building blocks. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Glenn so he can talk more broadly about the lessons learned across all of our CEDAR activities.
I'm going to deviate from the script a little bit because I want to highlight I'm going to sort of take an approach of thinking through the whole adaptation planning to implementation as a sort of a process. I've been working on these issues for 12, 13 years now, and I was involved in writing the first adaptation planning guidance with USAID back in 2007. And we made some mistakes. One of the major mistakes we made is we sort of followed the conventional wisdom on what criteria do you need to look at when you're trying to evaluate adaptation priorities. And one that we left out was financing. We looked at benefits, we looked at costs, we looked at issues such as ease of implementation, but we didn't look at financing. And the reason I mention that is one of the problems is we are still continuing to have countries do adaptation planning and not consider financing until like year 2, year 3, year 4. And you really need to be moving financing forward, to be talking about what are the constraints we face, how can we fix those constraints, and when you go to evaluate an adaptation option, if the financing is not going to be available, how can you prioritize it? You need to be realistic about financing as you try to develop your adaptation plan. A second thing that's pretty clear at this point is one of the major roadblocks to implementation is going to be the capacity to design projects. If you want to get money from the Green Climate Fund, you have to use a lot of international consultants. Almost all of the major GCF projects are being put together by consultants for UNDP or the multilateral development banks, because the criteria are very rigorous to get access to Green Climate Fund resources or to put an adaptation fund project together. And just as an example, in Peru, we developed 35 project ideas in agriculture, health, fisheries, and aquaculture. And we also met with some working groups and developed another 20 for water and forests. In my opinion, only 1 or 2 of those projects were really appropriate for for a GCF or a Green Climate Fund project. So the question is, how is Peru going to develop all of these project ideas? And there's a real need to help develop capacity to develop projects. The other thing that we observed in Peru and elsewhere is we're not bringing the private sector in very early in adaptation planning. Joel Smith was in Jamaica, and he met with 9 countries, and not a single country had set up a private sector working group or was inviting the private sector to participate in their national adaptation planning sessions. So this is another issue. And then I'll leave with one final sort of lesson. And this is a concern I've had for a long time. After we do a project, what are we going to do next? Are we committed in the government to sustain these projects that are funded, say, by the Green Climate Fund? If the project's worth doing, how are we going to continue that work? And how does that become part of the adaptation planning and implementation? So anyway, I'll stop there and we'll entertain. Eric, are you going to handle questions? Marcy? Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much for the presentation so far. And this is the time where we really want to engage the audience. We have, I don't know whether, Becca, we have a set of questions yet that you can give up to me with regard to some online questions have been brought up too. And we want to welcome our online audience who hopefully has been writing in and talking about some of the issues. Usually we have a good dialogue going on the whole time. And this is the time also for me to just give a little plug to the fact that on the Climate Links website, you will see a CEDAR project, and on the CEDAR project, the reports, the papers, the analyses are all up there, and the deck links are up there too, so that's a place for you to go. Becca will be distributing to all of you who are attending online or in person some of those type of links too. We took it out of today's presentation, but we'll be giving you those too. So just a set of how do you get to the information that's underlying some of these comments too. So let me kick it off with any online questions we might have. I don't know if Sophie.
So I think we've asked for online questions and are waiting, and I'll be sure to chime in if we get any, but I'd like to open it to anyone in the room who has any questions as a follow-up to the presentation or lingering questions about the CEDAR project.
Okay, well, let me,
yes,
okay,
here.
Go ahead.
I'll bring you a microphone.
And please introduce yourself, also, you know, the capacity or the project you're working on in adaptation and all interest.
Rose Schneider, Health Systems Management. I'm the chair of the International Health Section of APHA's, their Climate Change and Health Working Group.
Good.
And it seems to me that you said you want the private sector in early, but many of the donor-funded projects, especially in health, are focused on the public sector. So is that a big struggle to try to almost move the model?
No, that's a really good point, and I'm going to turn it over. I mean, I have some ideas on it, but let me turn it over to Glenn, because I think this is one thing when we went through the climate finance assessment, one thing we acknowledged that clean energy, lots of people can see the connection to private sector financing. You know, people are out there with renewable energy, solar, wind, et cetera. People now are beginning to realize that they make economic sense in many more situations. The same with sustainable landscape. You've got forestry, you know, and agroforestry. When we get into adaptation, their initial thought is private financing, you know, and you may have that same dynamics going on in the health sector too. So I'll turn it over not only to Glenn, but also to Lorene, because maybe in India you have brought the health sector in. Okay.
I think there's some interesting advances that are going on. I mean, one, in the last couple of COPs, the private sector's been much more actively involved than it had previously. The GCF, the Green Climate Fund, offers up to $3 million for national adaptation planning support. And in their criteria for accessing this is a requirement that you develop a private sector implementation plan. There's also requirement that the private sector be engaged, and there's a stakeholder engagement criteria, and you need to bring the private sector in. You need to ensure gender inclusivity, and that vulnerable and marginalized groups are involved in the adaptation planning process. So I think there's some things that are, you know, that look like positive signs. But one of the other things, the last thing on my lessons was a whole of government approach. And one thing that's happening in a number of regions is that instead of developing a national adaptation plan, they're doing sector plans. And the reason they're doing those is that they are looking at climate impacts on that sector, and then they're mainstreaming or integrating climate concerns into their sector development strategies. And for many of those, like agriculture, it's very difficult to avoid the private sector. Health is a little bit different. But in Peru, for example, half of the health centers are private. And the private sector is very engaged in doing a lot of, particularly in some of the rural areas, in providing those services. So I think the opportunities are there to bring the private sector in.
I'll just add briefly from the India example that there were a couple initiatives that were focused on the public health sector, but of course India has a very favorable enabling environment that provides a policy mandate to the private sector to contribute to those initiatives. So even though they were all public sector projects, private partners were able to contribute in this case, mapping expertise, the technical assistance, staff time to provide some of those services, drones to actually conduct some of the mapping exercises to improve coordination of health services during emergency. So in that case, there were specific roles that the private sector could fill where the public sector didn't have the resources or expertise available.
And if I might just add to this is Marcy again. One of the models we found, and this was throughout CEDAR, is that in fact the private sector is engaged in many of even the public sector financing because they're doing a lot of implementation. Ultimately, like you said, with the health sector, you're still having private companies that are having contracts with the health centers. You're having private sector engagement, and it's this embedded, if you will, private sector part of the business model that people maybe aren't appreciating as much as it is there. And that's been really important to understand that sort of private sector embeddedness, even where you have predominantly a public sector, if you will, seed funding or management systems, other things like that. And that resonates when you go out there a lot more, at the local level, a lot more than I think the national policy people are realizing. Because when you're out there, and we did the same thing with banks for like clean energy, we'd be saying to them, your own portfolio, what type of loans are you giving out? And they'd suddenly say, well, yeah, I guess we're giving out agricultural loans, but gee, a big part of their cash flow for each of these companies every year is paying out for the diesel generators, is paying out for this or that, and then maybe we can say to the health centers, are you considering solar systems? Are you considering one other activity we're doing is battery, energy storage systems too. And those are going to really start to transform that engagement of the private sector going forward. And I think that's one where you get excitement from the private sector and the realization that maybe it's not divorced from what we typically think as only public sector financing too. So, I don't know.
Any other questions? Yeah?
Jonathan Cook, formerly with USAID, as the slide says. So great to see everybody here. I just wanted to follow up that question. I mean, obviously the work in India, there is an asterisk next to it because of this very kind of unique mandate that they have for CSR, and as you said, that kind of created an incentive that wasn't really market-driven in some ways. But I'm curious what the takeaway is from the work kind of as a whole, looking at Madagascar and Senegal and other places where there is a private sector. It's maybe not what we think of as kind of the big corporations, but there are actors who are interested in some of these opportunities, who see risks. What other ideas were kind of coming out of those more essentially market-driven private sector contexts? And obviously there's two big entry points here for the private sector. There's a sense of sort of managing risk, and then there's a sense of business opportunity. And were some of those types of arguments resonating? Were they coming out in some of those other places? Thank you, guys.
I think we've heard some good examples of needs for private sector support in multiple activities that we've had. For example, when we're working in the agriculture sector, whether it's in Senegal or whether it's in Peru or any other countries that we've worked in, there's a clear need for better seeds, drought-resistant seeds to help improve yields during long-term drought. They need better equipment, even, nothing sophisticated, even some basic equipment and machinery. There's a clear opportunity for a private sector investment, not only to develop it, but to procure it and, to potentially benefit from its more widespread use. In the fisheries sector, we see some of those opportunities as well. There's a need for cooling technologies so that they're losing, less of their catch to spoilage. That was one of the things where we saw some overlap in our CEDAR Senegal adaptation activity and the clean energy activity. And there's this, this convergence of opportunities for renewable technology development and implementation in the fisheries sector to help adapt to different climate conditions. And so, we have heard examples of those clear needs where, like you said, it is more market-driven and not just because there's a mandate from the national government that companies have to contribute to. So I think there are opportunities for companies, private partners, to benefit from the development of technology and its more widespread use for adaptation activities, or whether it's clean energy investments or other sustainable landscapes activities as well.
When we worked in Peru, I worked in the health sector, worked with the working group on health, and we often are focused on investment. There's also a lot of policy issues, and one of the policy issues is making infrastructure more climate resilient. And there's some real opportunities in Peru. The problem, there's a lot of health clinics and hospitals that are located in flood zones and in dangerous places. And so one of the options that was being developed was to develop a set of standards for locating new facilities and also doing some analysis of moving existing facilities to safer places and that. And so you can look at it from the perspective that the public sector working with the private sector can develop better standards for infrastructure that is potentially at risk because of flooding. And Peru has some spectacular floods. They've had some really bad floods the last few years. The other area I think that's interesting is in the institutional investing. We're seeing private funds, equity funds and the like, that are applying more of a CSR, a corporate social responsibility criteria, and they're willing to make investments in lower rate of return investments, higher risk investments than they have in the past. And as most of you know, I mean, the amount of money that's available institutionally for investment in pension funds and other sources may actually provide some private sector money that can be used. And one final thing is in agriculture, we're beginning to see a lot of good examples where you can do aggregation models. And this is where smallholders don't have the credit worthiness or the assets to be able to make investments, and there's different ways of aggregating those farmers into a viable financial unit, either in cooperatives or organized by the folks that provide inputs like fertilizer and seed, basically doing forward contracts with them so that they provide them the seed and they pay them back when the crops are finished. And also the buyers of commodities are also doing a lot of technical and financial capacity development, doing some financing and guaranteeing certain floors for prices for a lot of the commodities. So I think there's some real opportunities in some of the sectors, particularly agriculture.
Other questions?
Thank you.
And anything from the online audience?
Yes, we did have one online from Michael Brown. He is our Environment and Natural Resource Director at Comonix, one of them. Michael asked, do you have information on actual success of different financing strategies as measured by financing obtained broken out by country or requesting agency, just to get a sense of what actually has been raised in the countries CEDAR is working with?
One example, actually it's a clean energy example, where CEDAR was, since the profitability of clean energy lending has high potential, but banks have still been very reluctant. It's been a new area. They're concerned about the risks of borrowers. The borrowers often need longer tenor loans than the standard bank loans. So we've been training banks in how to assess the market, gauge the risks of particular applicants, change their loan products, and also helping them access risk guarantees from the USAID Development Credit Authority. So we have $54 million leveraged in a couple of Central American countries for new loan funds that include clean energy for small and medium enterprises. But as has been mentioned, the business model for ensuring the profitability of adaptation is more difficult because, yes, you can save a lot of money by investing in adaptation. You just don't know when and where because of the high uncertainty. What is the change in global climate going to be? How is that going to translate at the national and local levels in the countries? How is that going to affect particular enterprises? So in Madagascar, there are areas where typhoon intensity is expected to be much greater, but there are other parts of the country where it may be expected to be a bit lower. Madagascar is very different from India. It's a very, very poor country. There has been a lot of political instability. International banks are not, anxious to enter operations in Madagascar. So it's basically going to be a more donor-dependent country. They're very interested in things like the Green Climate Fund. It's been as you all know, it's been a very slow mechanism that's had a lot of political difficulties. And then there are, in addition to the climate vulnerabilities, there is the enormous biodiversity wealth in Madagascar that may be their most likely source of funding that has adaptation aspects to it.
Also, I want to add to that, one of the things we do in the climate finance is, but at a very high level, we look into what are the sets of money going out, the streams of money from some different sources, and adaptation is one. It's a chapter that Glenn was heavily involved in, Charlotte were heavily involved in writing. You get numbers at a very high level. We have to admit that those are not generally broken down by country, or certainly by the countries we have. But what I think is an important question to ask, I'm not sure that the data can support that type of answers that you could be really, feel really good about. I think this is the next step. This is what we're pointing to, is you need to go back and look at how do you scale up some of these aggregation models or aggregate financing models too. And that, what I can say is that when we did use a model from actually agriculture sector, the Bureau of Food Security, which is business advisory sector, or business advisory supplier and providers networks too, we were fairly successful in the loans that were going out to some companies as regard to renewable energy and off-grid energy. What's important is that those type of loans could just as easily go, sometimes they went to schools, sometimes they went to solar systems from some small businesses, but they could have been to health centers. They could have been to conservation areas too. So it's a question of, once they start to feel the financial sector, the commercial FIs and financial institutions feel comfortable enough with these, then I think you can get to expand it to adaptation example. But number crunching, that's not really where we put those sort of big, broad numbers in.
Great, thank you. We have one question in the room and then another one online.
Thanks. My name is Pablo Torres. I'm also with CEDAR. It's actually a comment rather than a question. I think we've heard a lot about the design, engaging the private sector in the design of these climate adaptation projects and their implementation, and engaging them in financing very many of these activities. something we didn't talk about very much is the monitoring and reporting of adaptation funds. I think globally, there's obviously a very small amount compared to the amount of monies that go to mitigation. And there's another view to this, which is the private sector already carrying out very many projects that are not labeled as adaptation projects. So to Jonathan's point, projects that are seen as business opportunities rather than perhaps CSR projects. And so you gave a good example, Lorene, of a cooling project, for example, in the fisheries sector. Well, that could be, it is an adaptation project, but it's perhaps not being seen or reported as such in the same way that perhaps the private sector would develop, dehydrating technologies for food to prevent spoilage in hot climates or things like that.
Thank you.
I'd like to throw in another question. Sorry.
No, you're good. I'm going to go to one online, and then I'll come right back. Okay, so we have one from Joel Smith, and he asked, did you come across international or national firms assessing their climate risks, for example, the exposure of supply lines to flooding or storm surge?
Hi, Joel. I don't think we have encountered that specifically in the CEDAR activities that we've been working on. I don't know if, Eric, if you've heard of that, or Pablo, in the other activities, either clean energy or sustainable landscapes.
No, but in the in the Madagascar workshop in Antalaha, we brought in local small-scale producers who were involved in vanilla and cloves production, who were very concerned about typhoon damage that has occurred to their vanilla vines and their cloves. Fisheries, it's not an area where ecotourism, that part of the country is not an area where ecotourism has developed yet, but they're interested in it. There certainly are climate-related risks there. So I think CEDAR has been more involved and is looking at various other value chains for small-scale producers. We're not really looking at the large-scale corporate energy infrastructure. We are looking at things like national grids and how renewable energy can be best integrated into them.
Great, thank you.
Any other audience questions? Okay, we'll go to that first, and then I want to throw something out to the audience. Maybe even the online audience can just respond to.
All right, I can do that. I'm Mark Goldberg of the Climate Institute. I wanted to ask the panelists for any additional observations they may have on the utility of value chain analysis as a predicate for the necessary early stage development of financing strategies.
Well, I think that's a very promising approach, and CEDAR is currently has produced a draft cost-benefit analysis looking at some improved, more sustainable production practices for cacao in Ghana, and is also in process of doing work on looking at the value chain for beef cattle and pasture management in Ethiopia, as well as looking at pasture management for small ruminants and poultry production. So yes, and then we are also, USAID is also very heavily involved in, some of you may know the Tropical Forest 2020 initiative, where major transnational companies are committing to reduce deforestation in their value chains in beef production, soy, palm oil, and as well as pulp and paper industries, and a few others to a lesser extent, like cacao and coffee. The Global Climate Change Office and the Asia Bureau of USAID are also interested in looking at some of the other non-oil palm drivers of deforestation in Asia, and some upcoming work that will be getting underway.
That sets up my next question really well, which is, in the audience, I'm sorry, Lorraine.
I can just add one more example from our Peru activity about the value chains. The Peru Agriculture Working Group identified 3 adaptation programs, and 2 of those programs focused on agricultural value change. One focused on small producers and the other on mid-sized producers. But their idea, each of those programs had 4 components, was to look at the business development phase, the planning phase for the activities, and for the implementation phase and the monitoring phase to develop adaptation actions across the full value chain. So starting at the field scale and looking at climate impacts on productivity at the field scale, but also considering transportation and climate impacts on the access to markets and climate impacts on the storage of crops, climate impacts on production facilities and for processing facilities. And so they worked through this whole value chain to develop actions, from the field to the table. And it was a really interesting approach, an ambitious approach for sure. But the fact that the 2 of their 3 adaptation programs focused across the whole value chain and not just on a single component, I thought was interesting. That they're already thinking at that scale.
And that's where I'd like to sort of throw it back to the folks in the audience, which is, what are your programs? And talk, if you want to talk a little bit. We've presented results from CEDAR. Do you have results from the projects you're working on that have any nexus with some of the ideas that we've talked about here on either the financing, enabling environments, or capacity development, where you can share some results? So just, if you want to speak about that, if you want to come up and talk to us about that, I'd really encourage you to do that too, because that's exactly the interchange that we're trying to get, an exchange of ideas. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Marcia.
I did want to mention one more financing innovation. Again, it's another energy example, but with some Power Africa support, CEDAR has been experimenting with one of the complaints that some of the banks that have existing DCA loan guarantee agreements is they can't get a pipeline of good and bankable loan applications that meet their quality specifications. So CEDAR's been experimenting with an approach that where we have contracted with private business advisory service providers who work with potential loan applicants and help them get to that stage of having loan applications that the banks are going to be willing to fund. And the innovation here is that it's been through a pay-for-performance approach where those business advisory service consultants only get paid as certain milestones are met in the loan application process, and the bulk of their payment is actually tied to loan approval. If a loan approval doesn't happen, their remuneration is not high.
We have time for one final question, if there's any lingering doubts or comments. No? Okay. If not, I want to thank our wonderful 4 speakers today from CEDAR and from USAID. It's been wonderful to have you here today. And so let's just give a round of applause to our speakers. On behalf of Atlas, I want to thank everyone for making time in your day to come out and to join online. It's been really great to have you here and a more robust discussion with everyone here in person. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, our next Adaptation Community Meeting will be in March, on Thursday, March 21st at 4 p.m. That'll be a roundtable on heat and health, as he mentioned. And then also, as mentioned earlier by Marcia, what we'll be doing is we'll be posting the PowerPoint as well as the recorded webinar online. You'll be able to find that on climatelinks.org, and then any other resources related to the project will also be linked there. So keep an eye out for that in the coming week or two.